G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going to go through my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Japanese Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We're going to jump straight into my key deadline considerations, what that means for our F1 fantasy teams, as well as my asset tier ranking and final team thoughts ahead of this race weekend after a 2-week layoff. Let's jump straight into Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson and what that means for our F1 fantasy teams. For those of you that have been paying close attention to F1 fantasy in the 2-week break between races, Tsunoda and Lawson, as we know, who have swapped seats between Red Bull and VCARB, have also received new price increases, or price changes, I should say. And I'll just bring that up quickly for both of you. Tsunoda, you can see here, now is 16.8, up from his 8.4. This is a Tsunoda Red Bull card and not the Tsunoda VCARB card. You can see here he's now in his Red Bull outfit. Lawson, on the other hand, went from 16.8 to 8.4. Obviously should show his VCARB player card. But for those of you that own Tsunoda VCARB and Lawson Red Bull, they are priority transfers for this week. They will receive the not classified penalties from qualifying and the Grand Prix, which account all the way up to 25 points, negative 25 points in total. So if you do own VCARB, Tsunoda, Red Bull, Lawson, get them out of your team. No extra transfers, no extra budget to make those swaps, unfortunately, but should be high on your list to move on this weekend in favor of other assets. Particularly on the Red Bull front for Yuki Tsunoda, coming to his home track, there'll be a lot of pressure, a lot of expectation for him this weekend. I think he becomes a driver of the day candidate simply because of that. I would say if he looks good in the race, and I'd be watching him pretty closely in free practice to see how comfortable he looks in that Red Bull. But the Red Bull specifically has been very strong at Japan the last few years. Max Verstappen has put the car on pole and won the race between 2022 and 2024, and more on Max in just a second. But I do think Tsunoda becomes a very good differential and competitive asset at his price. He's the cheapest of the drivers in the top 4 teams, and I do think has more experience than obviously the likes of Kimi Antonelli, for example, who is, a couple million more. So I think Tsunoda, you throw in the fact that he had a points result last season in the VCARB. He is going to his home race, where he will no doubt feel very comfortable despite the pressure. And the Red Bull, although maybe not the fastest car on the grid, does have a good track record here. And if Max Verstappen can obviously bring that car to the front, I have every expectation Yuki could probably not obviously match that, but do similar or be in and around the top point scoring position. So I think one eye on Yuki Tsunoda, as I said, driver of the day potential for that popular vote. And as I said, at his price, certainly value for money if he can secure 16 points, which is going to be enough for him to see a price rise this weekend. Now, speaking of other transfers, they feel very obvious on the topic of what I'm alluding to, the threshold of what Yuki Tsunoda, for example, needs to see a price rise. There's a select number of drivers in that same family. And I think after many teams wildcarded last week in China, there are a number of assets in that cohort. I'm looking at Hülkenberg, Stroll, Ocon, for example, that are likely to go up in value again in Japan. So I think for those of you that do have that kind of flexibility or optionality, rolling transfers where possible would give you a bit more flexibility heading into Bahrain. And at Bahrain, that will be the 4th race of the season, and the first race where we will have a proper 3-week rolling average to dictate or to understand how prices are dictated. You'll also see that a number of the budget drivers will drop off at that point in terms of their expected price decrease. Doohan, Bortoleto, Hadjar all had those DNFs in Australia. They obviously won't be part of what their anticipated price change will be in Bahrain, because that first race of the season will not be part of the China, Japan, and Bahrain average. So if you have transfers to pivot into those cheaper drivers who should probably not be set up for a pretty serious price drop, I think that extra flexibility is certainly going to be important if you can carry an extra transfer into Bahrain. One other thing I will say is that Bortoleto and Hadjar especially are currently at 4.8 and 5 million. Now, 2 years ago, we saw Logan Sargent cap out or bottom out at 4.5 million. We don't know yet if Bortoleto and Hadjar will bottom out at 4.5 or if they'll go below that mark in the current pricing model. But I do think if they both bottom out at 4.5 million, having the flexibility with transfers and cost cap to move towards one of those or both of those assets will become very compelling budget building options. And I say that because having two 4.5 or one $4.5 million asset over someone like a Stroll or an Ocon, for example, gives you more flexibility to upgrade your 2X, to upgrade your premium constructors or one of your constructors. You might want to go McLaren Mercedes from Bahrain, for example. I just think having that flexibility and with the additional transfers and monitoring those price changes heading into Bahrain does certainly give you an advantage. I've got the wildcard up my sleeve. I will be using all three of my free transfers this week in Japan, and I think having that added flexibility certainly gives you more opportunity to capitalize on those price rises. Now, speaking of team value and price rises, it absolutely should still be a priority, to be honest. I think it's early enough in the season where there's really not much separating, people in the top 100,000 all the way to the top 500 to 750,000 in the world. So I think it goes to show, and I've emphasized this point in a number of my videos so far this season, that building your budget earlier in the year is going to set your team up for success later in the year when you can get to 2, 3, 4 high scoring premium assets in your team. Now, I think there's a number of teams that can get to, let's say, Piastri, Mercedes, McLaren in Japan, but it likely leaves you with Bortoleto and Hadjar to fill out some of those cheaper slots. So my point of view here is maybe waiting another few weeks, build up a bit more budget, use your wild card, your limitless in Miami, for example, to potentially leapfrog your team ahead of others when it comes to increasing your cost cap. I just put a video out recently on how to build budget, some strategies in mind, how the scoring and modeling is calculated for the price change algorithm this season. So check that out if you hadn't yet watched it. Now, I think another interesting point to me is also the 2x DRS boost candidacy. And I guess to that point earlier around making transfers feel obvious, what that template looks like for the next couple of weeks. The 2x candidacy for me specifically in Japan comes down to 3 drivers. In terms of, let's say, mainstream or template picks, Piastri, Norris, and Max Verstappen as a differential. Now, Max Verstappen was a driver I very much thought about having for this week to maybe claw back some of the Ferrari loss I suffered in China. The point, though, that I've thought about more recently is more or less boiling down to the threshold of him needing to score 44 points, if I'm not mistaken, on F1 Fantasy Tools. And I'll bring that up just to give you an idea of what that looks like. But Max, given his track record in Japan, understandably positions him well to score well in F1 Fantasy. But to see Max through for a $0.3 million price bump, he needs to score 44 points. Now, I think that's going to be a pretty hard ask for him to reach. And I say that because if he scores, let's say, 8 to 10 points, so qualifies in the top 3 in Japan and even wins the race, that gets him to about 34, 35 points. To get the 44, he then has to get the fastest lap, which I think is probably possible in wet conditions, or the driver of the day, which I think for Max Verstappen is bordering on impossible at the moment. So I think you're very much hoping for outcomes that you naturally can't always predict. I think he's had a number of fastest laps in the wet over the years. Brazil, the most recent one, last year, where he had a back of the grid drive to win the race, fastest lap, driver of the day, all of that stuff for a 70-point plus haul. Now, this isn't a sprint weekend, but 44 points in a non-sprint weekend is a pretty hard ask. You've got Lando Norris in the McLaren, Oscar Piastri in the McLaren, and even the Mercedes look pretty good too. So I think Max to cap out at 44 does seem like a bit of a steep ask, and that's why, for me, it comes down to Lando Norris or Oscar Piastri this weekend. I think if you can stretch to Norris, he's probably my preferred of the two. I'm pretty on the fence about whether or not I go down that path, but it kind of comes back to the budget building thresholds. I had, all of the drivers up before. I'll just bring it up again quickly for you guys to look at. Lando Norris only has to score 7 points for the $0.3 million increase. Oscar Piastri, on the other hand, needs 28. And I do think 28's well within reason for Oscar. He needs to finish in the top 2, I'd say most likely to see that $0.3 million increase because of how good McLaren look. It's certainly not impossible, but we saw Oscar struggle a little bit in the wet in Australia. So I'm not suggesting that's going to happen again. I'm not foreshadowing any bad luck for him, but I do think it, for me, comes down to Lando and Oscar for this week, and probably Lando if I had to choose between the two. Now, I'll just quickly bring this up one more time, this sheet on F1 Fantasy Tools. But in terms of the narrowing template, you can see in the B tier, Ocon, Stroll, Behrman, and Hülkenberg have to score 6 or less points to see the maximum $0.6 million increase. I'm fully expecting a lot of people to move towards these drivers this weekend, because all they need to do is avoid a DNF more or less to get that price bump. The same goes for Haas. They need to score more than minus 31 points to see a $0.6 million increase. And same applies also to McLaren and Mercedes. Very, very low thresholds, just simply because of their historical averages over the last 2 weekends, which have set them up for another price rise in Japan. So I do think the template is narrowing. Sure, Sonoda, Albon, Lawson all seem like options that may well see the maximum price rise, but the likelihood of that happening is certainly much lower than the Haas duo, Lance Stroll, who's off to a flying start this season, and Nico Hülkenberg, who's doing just enough to stay relevant in F1 fantasy at the moment. So I think on that, it kind of segues nicely into my driver tier and constructor tier rating for this weekend. I've probably talked about most people on screen here already, but McLaren, I think, goes without saying, the best options at the moment. In the A tier, Mercedes, I think, lead Red Bull and Ferrari. And I have Ferrari in terms of price rise at the bottom of the list. In terms of points, I'd probably have them above Red Bull, on par with Ferrari, on par with Mercedes. But I think the drivers, as I said, Lando first, Oscar, Max, and then I'd probably have George ahead of that. And then Lewis, Charles, not on the screen, simply because, again, all Ferrari assets are likely dropping in value again after those disqualifications in China. Onto the B tier again, the top 4 guys I've already talked about, and I like Yuki for that driver of the day upside. Alex Albon, Liam Lawson in the Red Bull. I've got their old race suits here, obviously, but Red Bull for Sonoda and V-Cub for Lawson. And then Hadjar, Bortoleto, Gasly, all drivers that will likely go down in price again. So steer clear of these 3 this weekend if you can. Haas and V-Cub, probably my 2 picks of the week for the B tier constructors. I have Haas again simply because the threshold is so much lower. And then after V-Cub, Williams, Stake, Alpine, and Aston Martin afterwards. So, I think these rankings, my point of view on them, largely dictated by the expected price changes for this weekend. I talked about this in my budget building video, that unfortunately free practice for me this season seems less important because of how we expect price changes to shake out with the new model. But I don't necessarily look at that as a overly negative outcome, simply just a difference with how the current pricing model is put together. So my current choice for this weekend, Oscar Piastri, will go through why I think he will likely end up as my 2X. It could change. I'm not ruling Lando Norris out at the moment, but he is my other alternative. Verstappen I've already talked about, but that threshold puts me off just a little bit. I do have the wild card in play, but do have also 3 free transfers, so I'd probably end up taking a -10 to make 4. I'm more than likely going to use my wild card closer to Miami at this point before I use Limitless, but I'll figure that out closer to those race weekends. And then autopilot for the wet weather. Undecided yet if I go down this route, but I used it in Canada in the wet last year, and Japan, there is some rain in the forecast, about 50 to 60% on Sunday. It seems to me that whatever source I read, it's either during the race, it's after the race, it's before the race. But again, keep your eye on the forecast. This video goes out before free practice because I will be flying back or flying elsewhere on Friday. So I won't have time to properly digest free practice results. And we are back to a non-sprint weekend, so qualifying is the deadline for this week as opposed to the sprint race, which we had in China last race weekend. So I'm going to bring my team up again on screen just for us to go through one more time. Now, I had Oscar Piastri in this slot, if I can find the legend. So I was capped out at 0.0 in Japan, in China, I should say. And for Japan, I've got 3 free transfers on the top right-hand side. For me, the obvious moves, just simply to negate some additional cost cap loss, is McLaren and Haas. I think they're going to be the most popular construct a pairing for engaged fantasy managers this weekend because of the budget building we have here on the screen. As I've shown, McLaren needing to avoid disqualifications and DNFs. Highly likely they do avoid that. Same goes for Haas, but joked in my budget building video that they have a history of double DNFs and double disqualifications in a sprint in a race weekend, I should say. So I think this seems like the logical path for me. I would really love to squeeze in. This is my team one, Yuki Tsunoda for that driver of the day potential. But because I'm obviously not able to do so, I'm more than likely going to go with Esteban Ocon. That would leave 8.3 million on the table. I'm not overly excited about leaving that kind of money on the table, but I think, as I've said before, really want to prioritize budget building. Now, I could, if I wanted to take a -10, go up to Lando. That's certainly an option for me this weekend. But on non-sprint weekends, I personally feel like Oscar Piastri can cover Lando point for point, dollar for dollar, more so than over a sprint weekend where there's an extra session of racing and more opportunity for Lando to bridge that gap. Now, the one thing I will say about Oscar Piastri is, I want to go into the statistics here on F1 Fantasy Tools. I'm not using Oscar per se as an example, but I do think there is a lot of upside for him to reel in Lando for points and overtakes and such. Going back, let's just start with the last race of last season. Charles Leclerc, I would exclude him from the conversation because he drove from the very back. But the top two drivers, 35, let's exclude back of the grid drives, but 35 and 33, again, Hamilton, I think, started a bit further back. The top 2, 3, 4 drivers are not separated by much. Going to Vegas, same again, separated by less than 10 points. In Mexico, again, separated by less than 10 points by the top, or close to 10 points by the top two. Again, separated by less than 10 points. We can go all the way back. All of the top two drivers are typically separated by less than 10 points. And I say that simply because I think it's very unlikely Lando wins the driver of the day. I feel like that popular vote last season we saw trailed away from him a little bit. I think Oscar's becoming more relevant in not just fantasy, but F1 in general. And I think at 23 million, he's really underpriced. I'm just not sure. Do I like Lando's consistency? His ceiling, I think, slightly higher than Oscar's. Points per million wise, if it wasn't for Australia's spin out, I think Oscar would be right up there with Lando. He'd probably be in the 80s for all we know. So I think this is probably my favorite lineup for this weekend. Do I take a -10 to get in Lando? I'm not sure yet. I've obviously talked about having Yuki Tsunoda in this slot here instead of I can't afford it, but if you can, I think that's really compelling. I could also, if I wanted to, that would put Yuki in there, and I think that would leave me just enough to squeeze an Ocon. So I could do something like this too. Again, that would be 1, 2, 3, 4 transfers. So a -10 for a lineup like this. Potentially, do I activate wildcard? I could do that too. But as I said, the template is narrowing simply because of these price changes, and this is kind of why and where I see the template going for this week. Now, I talked about Red Bull. I'm not sure I'm adventurous enough to go down this path because it would likely mean sacrificing McLaren. And I'm not really sure what you're able to do with this. Could you go George Russell potentially? I just feel like there are too many eggs in too many pies, or too many fingers in too many pies, too many eggs in too many baskets, whatever the metaphor is you want to use. A lot of top teams covering off. I'm more often than not someone that likes to kind of narrow my number of drivers across the top teams. So this is kind of an alternative. Could we go? I think I just wouldn't be choosing. I wouldn't be choosing Ferrari at all. The thing is with McLaren and Ferrari, you're really going to McLaren and Mercedes. Sorry, I'm losing my marbles here. You're going to have to go for the two bottom most drivers. And I just don't like that. These guys are going to tank. And I think for me, wait another few weeks before we do go down this path. So that's kind of where my head is at for my team this weekend. I will be back for another deadline stream on the weekend, so please drop by for that. But as I said, if you've got any last minute questions, let me know down in the comments below, guys. Hopefully I see you at the deadline stream this weekend. And if not, have a great day, and I will see you all very soon.